To meet these climate goals and avoid the worst effects of climate change, we have to emit as individuals no more than 2 tonnes of carbon dioxide a year. And guess how much a flight from London to Bangkok return emits if you were to jump on a flight now? Any ideas?
A tonne? Costa Rica is known as a world leader in ecotourism, with its lush rainforests, beaches and protected wildlife. And it's part of a growing market that promises to look out for nature, support local economies and let you explore the world without harming it. But here's the question. Can tourism ever really be eco-friendly? Or is the very act of getting on a plane, staying at a resort or hotel and taking selfies in pristine places fundamentally at odds with sustainability? That's what we're going to talk about today on What in the World from the BBC World Service. I'm Hannah Gelbart. And here with me in the studio is Greer Jackson, a BBC journalist and also the presenter of the BBC podcast The Climate Question. Hi, welcome.
Thank you so much for having me.
So first of all, when we talk about ecotourism, what exactly do we mean? Is there a universal definition or does everyone have their own idea?
Well, there is a formal definition from the International Ecotourism Society. They're a non-profit group and they define it as, and I'm going to quote here, responsible and purposeful travel to natural areas that provide and sustain social and economic benefits to local livelihoods whilst conserving the environment. So this isn't just about the environmental side of it. It's much more than that. It's about people. It's about society as well as the place. What does that look like in practice? It's very difficult to say, but it's typically going to be something that's small scale, possibly something that's locally run, that isn't exploitative, using local people for cheap labour, for instance. It might mean that the waste is managed on site. It might mean it has solar panels. It could mean a range of different things.
I mentioned Costa Rica. I went there and it was actually amazing. Lots of eco lodges. It felt like it was really trying hard to do tourism differently. Can you give me some examples of projects that are genuinely set up to be as sustainable as possible?
I mean, there are lots of places trying to do this. Whether they're eco or not is a question in and of itself. It's very hard to verify. You know, places aren't looked at on an individual basis. And we can talk a lot about greenwashing, where companies and lodges are pretending to be, or perhaps misleading the public into thinking they're greener than they actually are. And because it's not well regulated, it's very hard to say precisely an example.
Green are you?
Yes. Whether there's a specific location or a particular eco-lodge is in fact eco or not. But Costa Rica, as you've mentioned, is very well known for its ecotourism. There are other places that I've been which might be classed as ecotourism. For instance, I spent a few weeks in the Sundarbans on the Indian-Bangladeshi border in the mangroves, and that was all about seeing local wildlife, paying to go meet local guides to show us tigers and, local birds and stuff. So these are the sorts of things you might consider as ecotourism. But as I said, with that caveat, it's very hard to verify whether they are in fact or not.
And what's done differently in a place that you might stay that qualifies itself as eco-friendly or, a tour like you said, going to see tigers? What about that made it eco-friendly?
I think really we're talking about social environmental benefits. So when we talk about seeing a national park, we're paying to enter that park. And that, in theory, that money could be used to support the conservation effort. It could be used to pay park rangers, for instance. And in fact, we made a programme in Costa Rica, and what had happened was a lot of poachers, for instance, and illegal gold miners had moved away from that industry where deforestation often happens alongside those activities, and they'd moved to become park rangers instead. So they'd gone from destroying to protecting. So you might be funding those sorts of conservation efforts when you pay, when you buy handicrafts by local people. Those are the sorts of things that help support and bolster the local community. But also just things like restaurants on site. Perhaps they're not importing food. Perhaps they're using locally grown produce. So it's a raft of different things. It's quite hard to point to one specific thing.
One of the things that makes travelling not so good for the environment is getting there in the first place, especially by plane. Talk me through some of the problems that ecotourism is trying to solve.
Yeah, so I mean, in some ways when we talk about ecotourism, we're talking about the very local sort of aspect of it, right? We're talking about the hotel where you stay and what you do. And often in those tours, the flights aren't provided. And that can be around half of the tourism's emissions is just the flying alone. And there are lots of ways that people are trying to overcome that very nasty sort of carbon footprint, all the way from trying to develop these safer, cleaner fuels, but they're very energy intensive and they're very expensive and they're not made at scale. So that's a big part of the sort of carbon or climate footprint of a holiday, an ecotourism holiday, is the flights that aren't necessarily included when we look at the calculations of ecotourism. The World Travel and Tourism Council, they're sort of like a representative body for tourism. They do have these net zero targets. They want to be meeting what the world considers the best option forward to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees from pre-industrial times. But emissions have grown in the last decade leading up to 2019 by 3.5%. So it's actually proving, to me, that suggests it's very hard to have a properly eco holiday when emissions are growing from this sector.
Yeah, we actually did an episode on that, on whether carbon offsetting works. We asked, is it a con? But if we park the air travel side of it, what are some of the other issues that tourism can cause?
Yeah, I mean, because flying is around 50% of tourism's overall emissions, right? So the food, the accommodation also play a part here. But if we look at tourism's impact on climate change overall, it's around 9%, or just under actually, 8.8 if you want to be really exact, of the world's greenhouse gas emissions. Okay. That might not sound like very much. So let's just put it into context. If it were a country, it would be the third biggest emitter. So China emits roughly about 30% of the world's greenhouse gas emissions. America, the US, emits about 11%, and then India is at 7%. So you can see it's a huge contributor. And actually, as the world gets richer, people are expected to fly more and go on holiday. So there's a lot of sort of projections that suggest that actually its impact might grow in the coming decades as well.
This really is at odds with the idea of eco-friendly tourism. And if we look at the local level, the communities themselves, the local environment, what are the harms that tourism can cause?
So let's focus on the environment, since we're kind of already on the environment already. I mean, I was looking at a paper published last year that was looking at the mangroves in Southeast Asia, so the Philippines, Thailand, Malaysia. Some of the negatives were things like sewage was being leaked into the rivers. There was also issues of light pollution, noise pollution, which might impact the very wildlife that you're seeing. But also areas of the forest had been clear cut to make way for restaurants and lodges. But there was also sort of ways that the forests were being affected in ways you might not consider, or certainly I hadn't considered before. So, for instance, if there's more boat traffic going up and down these mangrove ecosystems, there's more wash, there's more waves, that erodes the banks, and then the trees fall over. So there are other sort of impacts to the trees that you might not necessarily consider. And, it's a mixed bag, because I think the impacts that it can have on the local community can be very positive, right? Like when you go to these eco lodges, I'm sure you saw when you were in Costa Rica, there's access to electricity, there's clean water, there's good roads, and local people benefit from that as well. They then get access to clean electricity and clean water and the roads. And actually, because of the boost in local taxes revenue, it means you get better schools, better healthcare. So there are some really big, important impacts on the local community. But I can't stress enough, the jobs aspect is mind-blowing. I was looking up some data, and 1 in 10 jobs globally last year were in tourism. 1 in 10 jobs. And so there are some countries where obviously this is more. I was looking at Tanzania, 9% of GDP came from tourism. These countries are so reliant on tourism to prop up their economies. It really can be very different for very many people depending on where you are in the world. And it's got to be managed very carefully. And this comes back to, one of the key definitions about ecotourism is it's not just about the environment, it's about the people, the society, the economy that live there.
So with ecotourism, Greya, is there a risk that it can be used as a marketing tool as opposed to a real, genuine solution to the problems that we've outlined?
I think a lot of it is well-intentioned, right? People want, as individuals, people are looking for eco options, right? Now, I'm sure there are some businesses and organisations that are just jumping on that trend rather than wanting to do it properly. But I'm sure there are plenty of others who really do want to have a meaningful impact and do it the best way we can. The difficulty is that the term ecotourism isn't really regulated. So we have to be really careful about greenwashing, for instance, making things sound greener than they actually are and misleading. There are plenty of examples of that.
What about the cost of staying somewhere more eco-friendly or going on an eco-friendly tour? Because they do tend to be slightly more expensive. Is that a cost that's verified? Does it risk excluding people from being able to travel in an eco-friendly way?
To travel in an eco way, it's not just about flying to a destination. You also have to take, I mean, if you really want to do it properly, you have to take a boat or a train, right? And there are only a certain number of people who get a lot of holiday or perhaps no holiday,
And don't have a job,
basically.
No jobs and endless money.
Yeah, like 3 weeks to travel somewhere, right? And that's like pretty exclusionary. But I think that extra price tag is also really challenging because that might be unaffordable for lots of different people. And the other thing around inclusivity, I think it's really important to mention, especially in the climate context, is that typically it's rich people going on holiday. And the people who are feeling the impacts of climate change are not the rich people who have money to adapt. They have access to knowledge and information, insurance even, to rebuild after extreme weather. Poorer people, where perhaps the destination countries don't have that adaptability. They might not have the money to rebuild after, say, a really intense cyclone hits. And there's a level of injustice here that people are going on holiday, causing a problem and then leaving. And then these people are faced with trying to fix something that they have not really contributed to in the first place.
So if we weigh all of this up, do you think overall that it is possible to go on holiday, to travel in a way that is environmentally friendly? Or is it inevitable that when we travel, there will always be some damage to the environment?
For now, you travel and it's very hard not to cause any damage to the environment. But in future, that might change. And indeed, the World Travel and Tourism Council, that's the representative body for major tourism forms, has got this pathway to reach net zero, which is what the best data says we need to reach by the middle of the century in order to avoid the worst effects of climate change, right? So there is a pathway, there is a way that people think we can do it. I think what's going to be really, really hard is the carbon footprint around flights. I've mentioned this before, but in order to meet these climate goals and avoid the worst effects of climate change, we have to emit as individuals no more than 2 tons of carbon dioxide a year. And guess how much a flight from London to Bangkok return emits if you were to jump on a flight now? Any ideas?
A ton?
No, 1.7 on a return flight. So you pretty much burn your entire budget, your entire carbon budget on one trip. And so that's where it's going to be really challenging. You know, we've talked about the challenges of offsets. There are lots of investigations that show that it might not be offsetting as much carbon as we think. And there are these sustainable aviation fuels, but they're not being produced at scale and they're so expensive. They would increase the cost of your flight by so much that actually you get into that problem we've been discussing about many fewer people will be able to afford to go on holiday. So I think it's going to be a challenge. And as I've already mentioned, the carbon impact of tourism more generally is growing. It's grown by 3.5% in the last decade leading up to 2019. And that suggests to me that the industry is having a really hard time getting a handle on their carbon emissions.
So maybe it's time for a staycation. Greya, thank you so much.
No problem. Thanks so much for having me.
That's it for today. Thank you for joining us. If you have any thoughts on this, if you want to share your experiences, please leave us a comment below. We're also on Instagram at BBC What in the World, and we're on WhatsApp. I'm Hannah Gelbart. This is What in the World from the BBC World Service, and we'll see you next time.